Hello and welcome to our webinar this morning on basic data analysis. We're going to go ahead and get started. Thank you all for joining us today. Today's webinar on data analysis is being hosted by Capacity for Health of the Asian Pacific Islander American Health Forum. We are a capacity building assistance program with offices in both San Francisco and DC, and our capacity building program comes mostly out of our San Francisco office. For those of you who don't know us, we are funded directly by the CDC to provide all kinds of free wraparound support services to organizations that are doing HIV prevention programming. We work in a number of different content areas. We do work around all the basic organizational development issues like strategic planning, board development, fund development, as well as doing work to support organizations implementing evidence-based interventions and public health strategies. And we do a lot of work to support monitoring and evaluation. And so today's webinar is part of a series, a 6-part series we're doing on basic monitoring and evaluation topics. So all of our services are totally free because we are funded directly by the CDC. And we'll talk a little bit more at the end of today's webinar about how to access further support and services. In addition to trainings and webinars, we do a lot of one-on-one support with organizations. We can do coaching. We can develop and tailor materials specifically to meet your needs. So if there are things that you're inspired by in today's webinar on data analysis and you'd like some further support for developing your program's data analysis capacity, we'd be more than happy to work with you. Just a few housekeeping notes before we get started with our content. You've all been muted automatically, and we will have a number of opportunities for questions and for discussion throughout the webinar. There's 2 ways that you can ask questions. You can click on your raise the hand icon, and we can actually unmute you so you can ask your question live. In order to do that, if your audio is through a telephone, you have to make sure to enter your audio PIN. Otherwise, we're not able to unmute you. Another way you can ask questions is through the questions feature, which is in the bottom right of the control panel that's on your screen. And at any point in the webinar, feel free to type in questions. If you're having any kind of technical issues, we'll make sure to help you so that you can hear and see everything. And any content questions we will direct to our presenter. And we'll have many opportunities throughout the content to answer your questions. If anyone is watching today's webinar with multiple people around one computer, please just go ahead and use that questions feature to chat in your contact information. We'll be sending out a link to the recording of this webinar, to the slides, as well as some additional resources after today's webinar. So the final note is that today's webinar is being recorded, and the audio recording and the slides will be available on our website after the webinar is done. So I'm very pleased to present Jessica Manta-Meyer. She'll be our presenter today on the topic of basic data analysis. I've had the pleasure of working with Jess for almost 15 years now, I think. She's been involved in developing, running, and evaluating a wide range of social justice and public health programs. She's done a lot of work with youth development, with women's health, and HIV prevention. And her current position is with an organization called Public Profit, which is a consulting firm in Oakland. They do a lot of work around strategic planning and evaluation. So without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and turn you over to Jessica, and she's going to talk with us today about basic data analysis.
Good morning or good afternoon, everyone. Quickly, the objectives for this webinar are we're going to dive into analyzing data. We're going to look at checking the data, organizing data, being able to use some different methods to analyze the data and interpret the data. Our agenda briefly. We're in the middle of some introductions. We're going to dive right into the 4 steps of analyzing data, and we're going to close with some next steps and additional resources. Our friends at Shared Action in LA have developed an evaluation framework, 6-step evaluation framework. Today we're really focusing on step 5, and we're going to spend a little bit of time looking at step 6, reporting out or sharing what we have found in our analysis. This is our 4-step path. We're going to organize data, check data, ask questions of the data, and share our data, plan on sharing our data with others. We assume that you all understand some basic mathematical concepts, but you don't necessarily need to use Excel or have any understanding of complex statistical analysis. And we're also assuming that your data is primarily closed-ended questions as opposed to open-ended questions. while we are going through the different concepts in this webinar, we're going to use a case study to come back to illustrate our examples. We're going to assume that we have run a 6-week leadership and training for peer leaders who will then go out and do some work around HIV and AIDS prevention in their communities. And we have them complete a workshop, a survey at the end of the workshop. You can see here some sample questions from that survey. And in a moment, a sample completed survey, what that might look like filled out. We have about 156 of these that we're going to be looking at today. Let's get on our 4-step path. First, we need to organize the data. We're going to start by looking at how we set up a spreadsheet. A spreadsheet is a fancy word for a really big table. You can do this in Excel. You can do this in Google Docs. You can do this by hand, although that's really only if you have a very limited number of responses. This picture shows what would be the upper left portion of the spreadsheet. The column headers will be your variables. Variables are the different pieces of information you're collecting. Each question or piece of a multi-part question is a variable. So in our sample, the age was a variable, gender was a variable. A quick note about, especially around race and ethnicity, we find this a lot. In our sample, for simplicity's sake, we're asking folks to check one race or ethnicity. In reality, and surveys sometimes ask you to check all that apply, in which case each race or ethnicity would be a separate variable. But right now, we only have that as one variable, and I'll show you that a little bit more in a moment. Here we are. We've added the variable names instead. We've replaced the column headers with the variable names from our case study. Each row then becomes a separate record. A record is information on a separate unit of service delivered or an individual questionnaire from an evaluation. In our case, the case study, it would be each post-workshop questionnaire is one record. It could be that if you were tracking information about participants over time, each record would actually be a participant with lots of different variables that you were building out. Here is our spreadsheet filled out with 5 samples from our case study. Each cell or each square has a value for each variable that comes from the source material. So for example, participant number 112 has a value of East Asian for their race or ethnicity. A few things to notice about this sample spreadsheet that illustrate best practices when you're setting up or organizing your data. First of all, anything that is words like race or ethnicity or gender, you might consider replacing with a number because it's just easier to work with numbers. So in this case, we've coded the data, the race or ethnicity groups or the gender groups with a number, and we're using that here. Also, you'll notice we're not leaving any cells blank. Participant number 12 didn't circle something for or circled something ambiguously for their knowledge of HIV and AIDS material before the workshop when they were reflecting back. And we entered 99 missing here. You want to enter something even when you're missing data so you know you just haven't skipped that information. And 99 is common practice. Each record should have a unique identifier. So we have that here. In our case study, we had folks already had an assigned participant ID that they knew and they're filling out on their worksheet. But you might have something that gets generated by having folks fill out some bits of personal information that you put together into a unique identifier. I've seen this commonly with first initial, last initial, and some numbers from their birth date or from their zip code. You just want to make sure that it's a long enough string that folks that you're not going to have duplicates, that you're really, really, really unlikely to have duplicates in your group. You can also assign a unique ID to, say, a questionnaire after the fact. You get 100 questionnaires, you just number them 1 through 100, even as you're doing your data entry. And that is one way to generate a unique identifier for a set of questionnaires. Why do we do this? It's the name of the record, so it's easier to track it, especially if we have to go back to the source record and double check our data entry. But also it is a way to ensure confidentiality. Depending on the confidentiality rules in your organization, you want to remove any identifying information, and instead you can replace it with some sort of participant ID, or the ID is linked to other identifying information somewhere else. We're not really going to get into confidentiality here. That is a piece that you'd want to have thought about when you're designing the questionnaire. But the unique identifier is one of the tools you can use to help maintain confidentiality. You inevitably will come across some ambiguous answers. So what is some good practice around the ambiguous answers? People are human. They're going to fill out their questionnaires. They're going to try to thwart your best laid plans of making them circle only one. So for example here, you can see someone circled 2 and 3 when we asked them to only circle 1. Problem with that is there's not really much we can do with that. In my judgment would be to place that as a missing response. Word to all of us questionnaire filler outers out there, because all of us fill out questionnaires too, that trying to be a little bit smart about needing to circle an ambiguous answer might mean that you've lost your own response in the great pool of data that you're trying to contribute to. So in the case of the first one up here, participant number 12 circled 2 and 3, my call would be to enter 99 missing, whereas participant number 140, the second example here, they checked female, they checked male, but then they went back and crossed out male. It's reasonable to assume that they meant that they are female, and that is what I chose to enter here. The main point, though, is you should log all these decisions as you go. That way, if there's systematic problem, you can start to notice that trend and go back and maybe make a different call, but find all the different records that you need to change. Or someone else coming along can have a better understanding of why you made the judgment calls that you did. Here would be a good time to let me know if there's any questions that are coming through that I can help answer. So if you have any questions about what we've covered so far, go ahead and write those into your question feature, or you can raise your hand. While those questions give you a chance for those questions to come in, talk a little bit about saving your data. As you're organizing your information, now that you've done all of your data entry, your initial data entry, you want to save a version for the past and save a version for the future. So I suggest saving a version called raw data that you put aside, you save, put it onto your computer. This is assuming you're working with a spreadsheet software. And then save another version of data to check. That's the data that you're going to take forward into the next step on our path, which is checking data. I'm looking to see, it doesn't look like there are any questions coming in yet. So I'm going to move on ahead. Checking our data, next stop. The importance of checking data is to check the data entry. Make sure that you've transferred everything from the source material into your spreadsheet and that there have been no mistakes along the way. If you're lucky, you can download something off of SurveyMonkey and go straight into an Excel spreadsheet. But more often than not, even today, people are hand typing in information from paper records. So you want to have a systematic way for going back and checking. Start with a spot check. This is where you just look at your spreadsheet and you can see if one column, the variables should be 1 through 5, and you see a 44, well, you know that's wrong right away. If you see a blank cell, you know you need to figure out what that is. If you see Excel loves to make numbers into dates and vice versa, so you see something where it should be formatted like a date and it isn't, that might be something that you can check and see easily as you go. Then you want to go back and look for the harder stuff to find. A good rule of thumb is check about 3% of your records, or at least 10, and you can do that in a couple different random ways that are outlined here on this slide. Once you have checked some of your records, some 3% or so of your records, you want to fix any one-time errors you see, but you also are looking again for systematic errors. Someone often typed a 2 when they meant to type a 3. When you imported data, records got mismatched, or you sorted 2 columns, but it didn't sort the rest of the columns along with it, some sort of systematic problem, and you want to find that, fix that, and then go back and check a new random sample of your records until you come up with a clean check and you feel like you can be reasonably assured that you've fixed all the errors. It's important to check the data because you're about to do a lot of time analyzing it, and then you want to make a case for some way you want to move forward with your program. You're evaluating your program for program improvement. You're going to make a case to your bosses, to your board of directors, to your funders. You want to make sure that you're basing all of it on a clean spreadsheet of data, and that is why this step is so important. Take another moment to see if there are any questions about what we're doing so far. Our path is to organize our data and to check our data. If there are any questions about that, please do blog those in your question feature. Meanwhile, now is another good time to save your data for the past and save your data for the future. So a naming convention I use is the data name data checked. I've double checked all the data entry. I move it on to bury it deep in my computer, or not bury it where I can't find it, but bury it, put it in the past, and I save a new version of it, just save a copy of it as data to analyze, and that moves forward into step 3 of our data analysis path. Step 3 is the meat of the data analysis. We're going to make some new variables. We're going to find out how often things occur. We're going to look at the centers or trends or typical values of our data, the average values of our data, and we're even going to compare some subgroups. So this is the meat, the heart of what we are doing here today. As we get started, we want to harken back to the evaluation questions or our program objectives or our logic models that we may have developed long before we developed the questionnaire. Just remind ourselves of why we're collecting this data. And as we do some math with the data, we're ultimately trying to get to the place where we are going to interpret it. What trends do we notice? How does the data answer evaluation questions or objectives? What does the context tell us about our data? And what additional questions does the information raise? How does our interpretation guide future evaluation efforts? Keep in mind, our interpretation should match someone else's interpretation. So if someone came along and looked at the same information, they should be able to come up with about the same interpretation as us. That's a good check on our work. Set aside some time for this. It takes time to do this in a meaningful way. We could do it quickly, but the point is to learn about our programs and be able to improve them. And to do this, we have to take the time to ask the right questions. And if we're coming up with answers that aren't useful, figure out new questions to ask. Or some of those additional questions that will get raised, take the time to be able to go ahead and ask those of our data. For a 2-page questionnaire with about 30 variables, you might want to set aside 8 to 10 hours to do the analysis. This is a pretty rough estimate, but that's the kind of time we're talking about here. It is worth noting that the length of time it takes to analyze data depends a lot more on the number of variables than it depends on the number of records. So the longer the questionnaire, regardless of how many people fill it out, the longer it's going to take to analyze it. You have a 30-item questionnaire, 30 variables to analyze. You have have 50 people fill it out, you have 500 people fill it out. Assuming you're using some spreadsheet software to help you with the actual addition and subtraction and averaging, it's going to take about the same amount of time to analyze, which is important to think about when you're setting up your questionnaire in the first place. Our first step in asking questions of the data is to create the new data. So we do this from existing data. We might want to show a change or difference, group some folks, and what we don't want to do is overwrite any of the initial data that we received, any of the raw data. So for example, in our case study, we asked people to rate their HIV/AIDS knowledge before the workshop and to think back to their knowledge, rate their knowledge after the workshop and to think back to what their knowledge was before and rate it retrospectively. So here we're going to find what the change has been. Make a column of self-rated knowledge pre, make a column of self-rated knowledge post, insert a new column, and record the change. We might also want to group some variables. So say we have, mostly we're reaching an audience of participants that are between 20 and 40. And we have a few teenagers and a few folks over 40, and they're sort of scattered around on the edges of our age range. We might want to group them as under 20 or over 40. You can see that I've done that here for those about 4 folks who fit those categories. And you would want to leave everyone else the same. So you would actually move forward. The 20-year-old would stay 20, the 32-year-old would stay 30, but the 51-year-old would be 40 and over. You can also group it into ages, into age ranges. Here, an example, age 15 to 24, 25 to 34, 35 to 44, etc. This might be helpful, for example, when you're collecting age from something or some other variable like that where people get to actually name something that's true for them, but you have a funder or a contract that's interested in it in a grouping. You can keep a hold of you can ask the age information, but then group it as needed for your different funders or your different contracts. Now that we've created the new variables that we're going to want to work with, we want to go about finding how often any given value appears. We're finding the frequencies in our data. We simply mean here to find the number of times each piece of information or value comes up in the data. For example, the number of females who filled out the questionnaire, or the number of people whose change in knowledge from the pre-test, from before the workshop to after the workshop was +2, and we usually write this as a %. We want to find the frequency as a % of the valid responses. Let's define valid responses. First, to get your total number of valid responses for any given variable, you exclude those records that didn't receive a response. So in our case study, we had a total of 156 records, or 156 questionnaires came in. However, 14 people skipped the question, how many sexual partners did you have last month? So for that variable, you have 156 minus 14, or 142 valid records. Once you have your valid records, then you divide the total number of responses for a given value into the total number of valid responses. So for example, 49 respondents circled 1 for their number of sexual partners last month. The frequency of 1 for that question would be 49, divided by the valid responses, 142, times 100%. The reason why we only take the valid responses is that those folks who didn't respond, who left the question blank, we simply don't know what the right answer would be. They could have had 1 sexual partner last month. They could have had 0. They could have had more than 1. If we don't count them in the 49 who did respond with 1, but we do count them in the total respondents, we're in essence mathematically assuming that they didn't have 1 sexual partner last month. They had something other than 1. But the truth is we don't know. So we exclude them altogether from counting the frequency. After you've found all the frequencies, it can be helpful to then make a new table with the frequencies for your different variables. In Excel, sometimes you can do this by doing a new worksheet and pulling data from the first worksheet that has all of your data entry data in it, and then creating some new tables in a second worksheet so that they're in the same workbook, but you're working with two different windows. So here you can see that we've calculated frequencies for gender, race, and ethnicity, how many sexual partners, and their change in knowledge. So that new variable we created, we've now calculated the frequencies for that new variable. Now we're going to start our interpretation. What trends do we notice? How does it help answer our evaluation questions or objectives? Start thinking about the data in the context of our programs and start generating those additional questions. So first of all, what do we notice here? There are a lot more males than females. 53% of the respondents are male. The largest group of respondents had 0 or 1 sexual partner last month. Not so many people, relatively speaking, had 2 or more. The most common ethnicities are white and African American. And the most common change in knowledge was 1 or 2 points. But of course, that's the raw frequencies, as it were, but what does all of it mean? We have to bring it back to the context of our programs, our objectives, our evaluation questions to understand the importance of these frequencies. So for example, when we look at the number of sexual partners that folks reported on their survey, we see that 21% of participants had no partners last month, 35% had 1. If one of our program objectives was to serve people who have a high number of sexual partners, most of the people who filled out the survey were, last month, monogamous or abstinent, then perhaps we are not reaching our target audience. However, we need to think about that in the context of our actual community that we're serving or our program objectives. Context is everything to understanding this meaning. So I'm sort of skipping ahead to another slide, but if you add up the percentage of folks who had 2, 3, or 4 or more, that's actually 44% of respondents. So perhaps that's actually a very high number of people who had multiple sexual partners last month, and we're totally meeting our objective. But that, of course, depends on the context of the program and the population in which you're working. Taking a look at the change in knowledge. One of our evaluation questions was about the change in self-rated knowledge that workshop participants reported. These frequencies here show that 80% of respondents showed improvement in knowledge. So 1, 2, 3, or 4. Overall, this seems good. But an additional question this data might raise is, why does anyone show a negative change in knowledge, that 2%? What is happening with the 18% who showed no change? This leads to additional questions. What do we know about the folks that showed no change or showed a negative change? Did they all come from one workshop, and maybe that workshop or workshop cohort, and maybe there was something going on with that cohort that we wanted to investigate further? Was there one group of people who engaged with the trainer in a certain way and sort of ended up scoring in this funny way where they showed a negative change? Who knows? But it does raise further questions that we want to ask. At this point, I'm going to pause, see if there's anyone interested to know if there's any other interpretation that people see when looking at this data, or if there are any questions about what we've covered so far. So so go ahead if you have any comments or questions about the frequencies that you see here, or interpretation that you would like to make, or any questions about what we've covered so far. Please go ahead and enter those in your question box. Keep in mind, as you're thinking about your interpretation, that if someone else is looking at this, they should be able to see the same interpretation that you see. And we're going to move on in a little bit to looking at the centers of the data, doing some subgroup comparisons or crosstabs, and then at the very end we're going to talk about sharing the data. So that's where we still have to go. But wondering if there's any questions now or comments about where we've been so far. Okay. Doesn't look like there's any questions. Oh, I do have a question. Sorry. Best practices in pre- and post-knowledge, self-rated and retrospective. So we know that what we do know, there was a recent study about this, is that asking folks at the end of an intervention to rate their knowledge or their skills in something at the end of the intervention, and then to think back to what they would have rated at the beginning of the intervention works pretty well. One study showed that it was a better measure of the skills or knowledge before the intervention than a pre-test was. So they took a pre-test, then they took a post-test that included asking back to what it was like before the intervention, and how they rated their pre-intervention knowledge or skills after the intervention more accurately reflected some objective measures that also had been done. So there's been some studies that suggest the pre-post retrospective format works pretty well. It tends to work a little better if you ask the post questions and then take away their survey and give them the pre-questions afterwards, so they can't compare the two in terms of being more valid, matching objective truth better. So I hope that starts to answer your question there. That's a very good question. Move on to finding the centers of the data. Centers, basically, we're looking at where, depending on the metaphor that makes sense to you, we're looking at sort of the typical value. I like to think about it as where the data sort of pools or congregates. It's the value in the middle, but there's a couple different kinds of middles, right? The words for these we may all remember are mode, median, and mean. The mode simply is the most frequently occurring value. In this case, the most frequently occurring value is 1. The most common response is 1 sexual partner last month. It also has the highest frequency. That is saying the same thing. In another example, males were the most common gender of the people who responded to the questionnaire. The median is the center value. It is the value in the middle when you put all the values in order. So first of all, you have to be able to put things in order. You can't find the median of gender. You can't find the median of race and ethnicity, but you can find the median of age because you can put the age in an order. You can find the median of something like a strongly disagree to a strongly agree scale. The median is the value that divides your data into 2 halves with an equal number of responses. From our case study, how would we find the center value? Well, you can use the median function or formula in Excel. But if you want to do it by hand, first you need to line up all of your values in order. There are 151 values. Halfway through is the 76th value. So you start counting. 30, 3 are under 20. Start counting from the very beginning. There are 3 folks who are under 20, 8 folks who are 20-year-old, 9 folks who are 21. As you start adding those up, we find that the 76th value falls smack in the middle of the 25-year-old. So 25 is the median. Okay, so we divide 151 by 2. 75.5 is halfway, so 76 is actually the middle value. There's 75 on one side of the 76th value, and there's 75 values on the other side. 76 is sort of the pivot point on a seesaw, a perfectly balanced seesaw. And when we count up using the frequencies or the ends, the 76th value is one of the 25-year-olds. So 25 is the median. Pause again to see if there's any questions about anything we've covered so far. I'm going to go ahead and ask that you write those into your question box or raise your hand if you want to speak. And we might even save those because we're going to go into the average or the mean, go through that. So if you want to start asking questions about anything we've covered so far, those can come up when we pause for questions in a few more slides. Oh, I've got a question right now, so let me take that. What happens when you have an even number of values? That's a very good question. So I sort of rigged the question by having 151 values. If you had 150 values, you do this funny trick where the median is, in our example, and I'll go back a little bit, then you find then the 75th value and the 76th. So the pivot point on the seesaw is between the 75th and the 76th value. So you find the 75th, you find the 76th, and you take the average of those. In this case, the 75th is 25, and the 76th is 25. The average of 25 and 25 is itself 25. So it would be the same answer in this case if we only had 150 records. But if it was, if somehow it fell on that line between 25 and 26, we would say that the median was the average of 25 and a 26, and that would be 25.5. The mean or average. It's the center of a weighted list. So instead of counting, having each value have an even weight like we do in the median, the bigger the value, the more weight it has, and it drives up the mean. In this case, you'll begin to notice that you can only take the mean of something that has a numerical value or a weight. So you couldn't take, it would be hard to take the mean of always, sometimes, and never, for example, because it doesn't necessarily have a numeric value, as opposed to taking the value of the mean of 1 time a week, 2 times a week, 3 times a week, or 4 times a week. So in here, you to get the mean, count up the number of responses for each kind, multiply that by the value of the response. So 1 times 2 is 2, 2 times 9 is 18, etc. Work your way through. Add up the totals. So our total frequency, we have 149 responses in this case, valid responses in this case. And the total weight, the sum of the weights of each is 616. We divide 616 by 149. And we get an average of 4.13. If you take a look at the numbers, you can sort of guess that it was going to be between 4 and 5 because the biggest chunk of responses, 56 folks responded, rated their knowledge of 4, 63 rated their knowledge of 5, and the other numbers are much, much, much smaller. So we sort of intuitively know that the number is going to be between 4 and 5, and it's closer to 4, even though there are more responses that are 5, because of all those 3s, 2s, and 1s pull the average down. Finding the centers of the data, the mode, median, and mean, is interesting. Certainly the mean is the one we work with the most, the average. But sometimes we have kinds of data that we can't find the mean for. So data basically comes in 3 types. There's the unordered categories like gender or race or ethnicity. You can't find a median because you can't line them up, and you certainly can't find a mean because you can't line them up, and they don't have a weight. So the only thing you can tell about those are what is the most commonly occurring, about that variable itself. What is the most commonly occurring one, or the mode? This is sometimes called categorical data. There are ordered categories, sometimes called ordinal data. You can find the mode of that, the most commonly occurring one. You can also find the median because you can line them up. But like always, sometimes, or never. But you can't necessarily find the mean of them because they are not numerical values. And that is the third kind of data. That's the data we like the most because we like means the most, the average the most. And we can find all 3 kinds of centers. It's the most flexible kind of data. So, for example, this is a gray area I'm about to reveal here. If a common scale on questionnaires is always is strongly disagree, disagree, agree, and strongly agree. Technically, those are ordinal categories. They're not numeric. They don't have a number value. However, for purposes of analysis, we often assign a number to them. Strongly agree being 4, usually, and strongly disagree being 1 at the other end at a 1. And then we find the mean or average of those scores across all of our responses on our questionnaire. And we compare the means. We do some analysis with that. But we want to keep, and that's sort of it's okay to fit that a little bit into a numerical category, so long as we never lose sight of the fact that really originally it was an ordinal category that's sort of quasi-numeric, so that when we make claims about it to our audience, when we share our information, we're always pulling back to those names. So for example, our average response might be a 3.2. So if agree is 3 and strongly agree is 4, and then we also have some disagrees and some strongly disagrees on some question, and we find an average it's 3.2, what does that really mean? Well, that means most people were agree or strongly agree on that particular question. That's good, hopefully. But we would want to remember to bring it back to the wording of the question and the response choices to be clear when we share our interpretation or analysis with others. I find it helpful to go back and add some more information to our frequency tables, like this center information. So here, the most commonly occurring gender is male. The most commonly occurring race or ethnicity is white in the sample that we had. We got to sexual partners. We can find the most commonly occurring, which is 1, and we can find the middle point, which is also a 1, so those agree. The reason we can't find a mean here is because, and this was a little bit of a behind-the-scenes maneuver, we rolled up everyone who had 4 or more sexual partners into a 4+ category. So we took what was a numerical variable, grouped a whole bunch of people at one end of it into 4+, and by doing so made it an ordinal variable where technically we can't find the mean. Now, good practice was we kept our original values. We could actually go back and find the mean of all of the responses. But as represented here in this table, we wouldn't be able to find the mean because we've grouped people into 4+. And we have no idea of those 13%, how many of them are 4, 5, 6, 25, 88, who knows? Not to get too crazy. And then in the change in knowledge, we have, that is also a new variable that we created, but it remains numeric because we didn't group anybody. We just did a calculation of a change into a new number, so we're able to find the mode, the median, and the mean. In this case, there's some variation there, which is interesting. The most commonly occurring is 2, but the halfway point is 1, and the mean is sort of a little bit in the middle. And this reflects the fact that you can see that common response 1 and 2 are about the same frequency, and that there's some pull on either side, and a little bit more pull in the lower numbers that pull the that pull the mean down just a little bit closer to 1. We're going to go back to that table and start building a little bit more of our interpretation. More respondents had one sexual partner last month than any other possible response. Also, 1 is the halfway mark of all the responses. These centers, as I said, strongly agree with each other. This supports observations we made when we were just looking at the frequencies. However, as we've said, one of our values was to target participants with a high number of sexual partners. So is this response, does this tell us that we're hitting our target? As I said before, looking at it from another angle, 44% had 2 or more sexual partners, so this raises some additional questions. How many people in the population have more than one sexual partner in any given month, the population we're trying to serve? Perhaps we feel that 44 is actually a very high number and matches our program objective. We also might know that we're dealing with a population that has a wide variation in the number of sexual partners they have on any given month, so maybe 44% for a given month is perfectly fine in terms of meeting our program objectives of reaching that population. This is where additional research, looking online into what researchers are saying about our population would be helpful. The most frequently occurring gain in knowledge is a 2-point gain. However, some of the participants show only a 1-point gain. Half the participants show 1 point, no point, or even negative points, actually. Those that show negative points are worth thinking about further. We've already touched on this. Why do people show a 0 change? Why do people show a negative change? What might we want to know about those folks? Also, the mode, the most frequently occurring is a 2-point gain. Is that good enough? If we had a lot of people coming in who rated their knowledge before the workshop as a 3, again this is on a 5-point scale. If a lot of people coming in start out at a 3, then they only have about 2 points to grow. So maybe we're not reaching the people who really need to learn, or maybe we need to adjust our scale in some way. However, if a lot of people are coming in at a 1 or a 2 and still the average is only a 2-point gain, how do we feel? Is that an acceptable increase in knowledge on the part of our participants? Are we looking for something higher, or a 3 or a 4? Again, placing it back in the context of the population that you're working with, the objectives for the workshop or the program, or the evaluation questions you've set out for you will help interpret this information. And as always, someone else looks at at the same information, they should be able to see the same interpretation as you. Pause again for any questions that might be coming in right now before we move on to comparing subgroups. Comparing subgroups is often called cross-tabulating information, and it is good. We're still, for those of you who are listening and have a slow connection, we're still on the questions screen. And I'm still interested in hearing if there are any questions, but I'm going to start talking ahead to where we're going next. They're particularly helpful when we want to know those questions like, is there any information about those folks that had a negative change in knowledge? So maybe what we want to do is there a gender related to that? Are there people of a certain gender that are most likely to rate their knowledge change as negative or as 0? Or are there other questions we want to know by gender? That is when we're comparing, what I mean by comparing subgroups, or when we're doing a crosstab. We're looking at breaking down different variables by a key variable such as gender. Frequently we do this by gender, we do this by race or ethnicity. In this particular case study, we might do it by number of sexual partners. We might go back to those 0, 1, 2, 3, and 4 plus and look at how those different groupings of folks, or maybe 0, 1, and 2 or more, how those different groupings answer different questions to see if there's any differences between those different groups on other questions. Please do continue to blog in any questions, but I'm going to go ahead and move on, and I'll be happy to answer any that come through. So say one of our evaluation questions is how does self-rated knowledge of safer sex information differ among people by gender? So this is not the change in knowledge we're not looking at in this particular example, but we're looking at the actual absolute rating that people give themselves after the workshop. They now rate themselves as a 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5. We create another table, new Excel worksheet. This time, we put the subgroups along the side as the row headers and the possible values for self-rated knowledge post-workshop in this case along the top. So we have our different gender categories, and we have which are categorical data, right? Not ordinal, not numeric, categorical data. And we have our numeric self-rated knowledge data across the top. Across the top of the screen of the table. We're now going to enter some responses for each cell. So this is a sample from our case study. In the upper left cell, you see a 0. That means that the number of females who self-rated their knowledge at the end of the workshop, a 1, is 0. And we entered each cell accordingly. We add up the totals. This is partly, especially if you're doing this by hand, as a way to check your work. And then we convert those into some percentages or frequencies. And you'll notice that I just dashed out the squares that had no respondents that met that criteria. So the females that responded 1, we didn't have any, just to make it all easier to read. We did have one question come in. I wanted to address that briefly. If 3 or more people have a 5 on the pretest, how will this skew the data? If folks have a 5 in the pretest, then regardless of how many of folks there are, maybe I'm misunderstanding the question. Please send a clarification if I'm not answering your question right. If folks have a 5 on the pretest, well, the way in terms of analyzing the response and bringing it back to your programs, it doesn't skew the data so much as tell you that maybe you're reaching the wrong people with your workshop. If people think people are already bringing a lot of knowledge. An alternate interpretation, look at their change in knowledge. If those people are 5s when they come in, they rate themselves a 5, and they are a 3 after the fact, then maybe what they're trying to tell you is that they thought they knew more than they did at the beginning, and they realize now that they're more of a 3, even after the workshop, because they've calibrated their own knowledge more accurately. So that, to me, would lead to many more additional questions in terms of further research. Might generate some interest in doing a focus group with folks to see if they can explain why people in their cohort might have put a 5 at the beginning, and how that relates to what they put themselves at the end of the workshop. Going back to our slides, what are some of the things that we notice? First of all, most females rated themselves a 4 or a 5. The most common response over most common group, the biggest group, is males who rated themselves a 5. But male to female transgender respondents, while most of them, the biggest grouping, rated themselves a 5, there's still a significant group that rated their knowledge at the end of the workshop as a 2 or a 3. So that raises some questions about what is going on with our male to female participants. Looking at the central tendencies, this is another, so that mean, median, and mode, this is another way to look at that same data in a slightly different light. So for example, females rated their post-workshop knowledge lower than males. Their median was a 4, their mode is a 4, so their most common response is 4. They really centered around 4. Females had a pretty consistent experience of the workshop and rating their knowledge at the end of the workshop. Males also pretty consistent. They most commonly rated themselves a 5. More than 50% rated themselves a 5. That's what the median tells us. The mean is a little bit lower, but that makes sense. When your mode is high, at the high end, at the extreme end of one range, your mean's probably going to be lower because inevitably there's a few values over at the other end, pulling the mean down. We can see for the male to female transgender respondents that things are a little bit more all over the map, which is what was reflected when we looked at the table in the previous slide. The most commonly occurring response is 5, but 50% had 3 or rated themselves a 3 or lower, and the mean also is low, closer to 3. And that diversity in the central tendency numbers reflects the diversity or the spread in the responses among those participants. We don't include female to male participants or other participants here, so the other genders that folks could select, because there were so few of them overall. There were 6 total who fit those 2 categories. And at that point, you don't want to ask you don't want to, as good practice, you don't want to have a lot of interpretation about those folks because there's just not enough people to represent their population. I'm going to move on to give you the opportunity to ask any questions about this chart, so going back to the frequency chart, or to blog in any interpretations that you have when you look at it. And then we're going to quickly talk about some key points in sharing your data. So go ahead and blog in or any questions or any comments about the frequencies or any of the stuff that we've covered so far. And we're at our step 4 of sharing our data. Sharing our data is an essential step in evaluation. If we really want to improve our programs, we often need other people's interpretations of the data, so we need help. We need other people's support for the context. We may understand it in a certain light. Other people may have other context information for the data. But maybe even most importantly, we need their buy-in for program improvement and for change. Since improving our programs is the heart of evaluation, sharing our data is a critical step in the analysis process. First of all, determine your story. Maybe your story is you're meeting your objectives. Maybe it's that you're meeting most of your objectives for most of your clients, but you don't seem to be meeting gender Y or race or ethnicity Z as well as you would like. Maybe it's that you're meeting your objectives, but you've discovered a whole slew of new evaluation questions that you want to share with everyone and bring them on board about. Standard public speaking, pick 3 talking points and stay on message. Invite some people to hear you. You can make a flyer, you can send out a report, but a presentation to folks really can spark some interest and some discussion. And let me not, as we all know, we shouldn't underestimate the power of feeding people when we're talking to them to help them understand how important what we're saying is. And then always, of course, leave time for questions. One final note about confidentiality. When you're sharing information, obviously don't share information about that where folks can identify the person that you're sharing it about. If you have one 23-year-old African-American male in your program, you don't want to talk about the number of sexual partners the 23-year-old African-American males had last month, to use an extreme example. But even if you have only a few people that fit a certain category, like a few slides ago when I didn't include female-to-male transgender respondents in our table, because there's so few that to share any information about what they're saying, it might be pretty easy to narrow it down to a particular person or narrow it close enough. And then, of course, when you're done, remember to celebrate all the hard work you've put into preparing your data, checking your data, analyzing your data, and now sharing it out with the people who care about it, care about the programs along with you. To close, I would love to have people blog in some ways that they feel like they can improve their data analysis based on information that they've received from this webinar or other ideas that folks have. Again, please use your question feature to blog those in. And while we're having folks do that, I'm going to turn the presentation back to Sonia and Capacity for Health.
Thank you so much, Jessica, for your presentation today. Just as folks are writing in their last few questions, I will just remind you that this webinar was the fourth in a 6-part series. And we do have 2 more webinars coming up. We have one February 8th around developing evaluation plans and one on February 22nd around developing quality assurance plans. So information about all of these webinars as well as other capacity building assistance services we provide is available on our website. We also have a great online resource library that we've launched recently, which has slides and recordings of all of our past webinars, the recording of today's webinar, as well as the slide set, and some further written resources that accompany this presentation will all be available on our website, on our online resource center at the web address you see on your screen. And also, as I mentioned at the very beginning of the presentation, we offer totally free capacity building assistance. So if there's anything that you were excited about or inspired about in today's presentation that you would like to learn more about or get some one-on-one support around, we'd be more than happy to work with you, provide you with some coaching or some more materials or resources as you embark on your own data analysis processes. So I know that we are approaching the end of our scheduled time together. Both Jessica and I will stay on the line for a few more minutes if there are other questions. Jess, do you have any questions that have come in that you'd like to answer?
I appreciate some of the responses that people have. Someone in particular said valid. They'll be thinking more about the valid responses when they're doing their analysis. I think that's great. But no, there's no other questions that have come in.
Well, thank you all for joining us on today's webinar. If there aren't any other questions, we'll go ahead and close out the presentation part. And as I said, Jessica and I will both stay on the line. So if there are other questions, please feel free to click on your raise the hand icon or chat them in using your questions box. We are happy to stay on the line and continue talking with you about data analysis as long as you have questions you'd like to ask us. So thank you again to all of us who joined us. Please join us for further webinars in this series, and feel free to contact us for any other capacity building assistance we can provide you with. So we'll just stay on the line for a few more minutes. If there are other questions, go ahead and click your raise the hand icon. We can unmute you and have a conversation live, or you can write them in using your questions feature.
And so one other question has come in regarding the study about retrospective pre- and post-test. And if that's okay, Sonia, can I send you the reference to that article and you can send it out to the participant list? Or
yes, we will actually go ahead and post that along with the resources for this webinar. That will be on our website and the online resource library. We'll post the reference for that article.
Great. I will hunt that down this afternoon and get that to you.
Any other questions for Jess around basic data analysis, or for me around capacity building, or other resources we have around monitoring and evaluation? All right, it doesn't look like there's any more questions coming in. So thank you again, everyone, for joining us today. Thank you, Jessica, for your wonderful presentation. The information about how to contact us is still on your screen, so please feel free to be in touch with us. We're also always looking for new topics for materials to develop and webinars to host. So if you have some burning curiosity or needs in any areas, particularly around monitoring and evaluation, which is the series, please blog those into us as well, or send us an email and let us know what you'd like to see. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us on today's webinar. We're going to go ahead and close it out now.